On Sundays all across the world, Christians partake in a supper that doesn't really fill the stomach.
However, as we gather around, it is supposed to be a reminder of the cost of our souls, the worth it has, and our call to walk with Jesus each day.
Why is the Lord's Supper important? We're going to talk about that today. Welcome to the Pilgrim Song. Welcome to episode 28 of the Pilgrim Song. I'm Alexander.
And I'm Charlie.
And we're your favorite interracial friends here to talk to you about Jesus. We are so glad to be back with y'all yet another week. We hope you enjoyed our podcast from last week on forgiveness. That was one of the better ones that we've done, I think it was,
for sure.
Very impactful. And it was something I thought about a lot last week, and it convicted me a lot because I had to think about, am I being unforgiving or holding a grudge? I don't know.
Yeah.
It made me think about it, even though I was alone. But that's also something you learn with teaching, is that you learn more than the students a lot of the time. So, but we hope you guys enjoyed it. If you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it. It's a good one.
Yeah. And when we think about forgiveness, right, we think about the ultimate sacrifice that was paid for us on the cross. And with that, with Jesus giving his life, one of the ways that we remember that today is with the institution of the Lord's Supper.
Charlie is just killing me.
I know, man. The segue game is fire. So today what we want to talk about is the Lord's Supper. Something that we partake of every week. Maybe it's something that you've heard about. Maybe you've partaken of it. Maybe you just think it's some weird thing you don't really understand. Maybe we can clear a lot of that up today. But really, growing up, I remember, some of my oldest memories of going to church when I was like a little kid is watching my parents, like when the trays got passed around, they'd break off a piece of bread and eat it, and then take a little thing of grape juice and drink it. And I'd always be like, man, that looks really good. Like, I want to do that. Like, why can't I have it? And, just this moment where the congregation got, dead silent. Everyone got focused, it looked like anyways. And, I wondering, I didn't ever really understood like what it was or like why until I got older, and it was like finally explained to me, what they were doing. And then obviously when I became a Christian, I began to partake in it myself. But honestly, when I first became a Christian, when I was first baptized, I don't think that I still had the full understanding of exactly what the Lord's Supper was. When I was baptized, I knew who Jesus was, I knew what he did for me, and I knew that I was in sin, and I was scared that if I died at that moment that I would not be in heaven, because I knew what I needed to do and I hadn't done it yet. But every little detail, including all the facets of the Lord's Supper, I don't think I really fully grasped, and so it's something that I've really tried to study a lot on, try to get a better understanding of, and to better help myself as we're partaking of it, to, meditate and to think about the things that I should be thinking about and keeping my mind focused. So I don't know, what was your experience with the Lord's Supper?
Oh man,
growing up?
It's a very interesting part of our service, because as you mentioned, people just go dead silent, and if a kid starts crying in that, it's always like kind of awkward.
You can't go to the bathroom during it.
You can't go to
Remember
the
that
bathroom.
when I was a kid? I had to go to the bathroom one time. My parents were like, no, it's the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
You will sit here until after it's over.
It's very interesting. I don't know, like reverence that I think a lot of people have for it. And I think that's good, obviously. Back home, they did this thing I really liked, where the same person would, for a whole month, would be leading the Lord's Supper talk.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
He got to go through maybe make some different points out of the same text or all that type of stuff. So you could kind of follow his thought through the whole month, and that was a good way to help me focus on it a lot. Also have a lot of funny stories with people spilling the Lord's Supper, dropping also one time where they went to open up the bread tray, during the service, and there was no bread there. Whew. That's intense. But
oh no.
The Lord's Supper is something very serious. You take it very serious. The way that I remember it, though, are usually when people messed it up.
Yeah, that's probably true. One time I was getting one of the cups out of the grape juice, and apparently I gripped it too hard, and I shattered the cup in my hand. It just splashed me with grape juice. And I was in a white button down, so that was fun. I was with my grandmother, and so she went to like full like grandmother mode and like started like freaking out, like trying to take care of me, like during the Lord's Supper. And I'm like, it's fine. Like I'll be fine. Like just some grape juice. Like got a different cup. It's humiliating. But yeah. Now every time I go back to that congregation, every single person in there, every time I walk in reminds me of that time. They'll be like, hey, don't forget the Lord's Supper trays come around. Like, be careful. They do break. And I'm just like, thank you.
They should listen to our podcast on forgiveness.
But yeah. So obviously this is something that's important because it's something that we do every week. But necessarily understanding why we take it or what does that mean? Maybe that's something that you haven't really actually thought much about. And maybe that's something that we can help you with a little bit as we go through the podcast today. So to kind of start off, the first question we want to, look at is why? Why do we take this weird like meal, not meal thing that we do every Sunday, every first day of the week? Why do we do that? What does it actually mean for us? And I think the first place that you can look to kind of find meaning in this is actually the Passover in the Old Testament, in Exodus chapter 12, when the Passover is established. So under the old law, the Jews partook in what's called the Passover every year. And they did this to remember how God delivered them from bondage in Egypt. And this was done by the sacrifice an unblemished lamb. When they were in Egypt, they were to sacrifice an unblemished lamb. They were to cover the doorposts of their house with the blood. And then when the angel of the Lord came through to kill the firstborn son of every family, he would see that blood on the door and then would pass over their house. And so then they would be delivered from that. And there was, a lot more details in that, but that's kind of the overall gist of it. And so every year after that, they had the Passover feast that they would do, which is where for an entire week they would celebrate this. They would remember what God had done for them. Part of that was they would eat unleavened bread for the entire week. And in Exodus chapter 12, God went as far as to say to like throw leaven out of your house altogether. So like for an entire week, like just unleavened bread. And yeah, so they'd be able to partake in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a part of the Passover that they would have every year. And this is probably one of the Jewish holidays that we see them, not holidays, but feasts that God establishes for them that they consistently actually kept, with the exception of when some of the kings were bad, they have to reestablish some of those. But for the most part throughout Jewish history, some of them, like the Feast of the Booths, that kind of things, you never really see the Jewish people like actually remembering to do that every year. But the Passover has been one of those that I feel like was always there and is actually, still there today. Yeah. So obviously it's extremely important for them. So then we bring that into today, right? And we bring that into to modern times with Jesus and then beyond. And so when Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, it's in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and in John 13, kind of. John is a little different than the other three Gospels, where he doesn't actually like specifically show like the moment where Jesus passed around the bread and then passed around the cup and talked about it. But he does talk about when they sat down together and they were at the Passover feast. He focuses a bit more on what Jesus like taught about that evening, which I really like. It gives you more information as to what Jesus said while they were sitting around together. But it's still there. So it's something that's across all four of the Gospels. And what Jesus was doing here is he's saying, at the time when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, I guess just to say this, they were partaking of the Passover. So they had gathered around together to remember this. And what Jesus does is he says, as we're partaking of this Passover, right here, I'm going to establish what is basically the new Passover, right? God freed the Jews from bondage in Egypt. I'm going to free the world from bondage of sin. So Jesus, right, he's going to take on that. He is the unblemished lamb that's going to be sacrificed, whose blood will then be able to cover us, that we may be able to find favor in the eyes of the Lord and be able to be a part of God's family and be with him someday. Just like the Jews did with their lamb, and the angel passed over them and they were delivered from that. Jesus was going to become that Passover lamb for us. And so he's saying, we did this every year to remember this. here's what you're going to do now to remember my sacrifice and what I'm going to do. I kind of look at it as he's establishing a new Passover.
Yeah.
And so the only stipulation that's different is instead of it being once a year, this is something that we do every single week, and hopefully something that we remember every single day.
Yes.
Although we specifically take of the meal or of the feast, I guess, whatever you want to call it. I guess this new Passover, right? This Lord's Supper is what we like to call it today. We partake of it every single Sunday, if that makes sense.
That's what I appreciate about you bringing up him being the lamb and comparing it to the Passover lamb, because like that's one of the important reasons that we read the Old Testament. So we see these patterns that God has been making all throughout time, and then it gets fully established and finds its ultimate foundation and I guess meaning in Christ. So particularly the Passover lamb, but you'll see this with plenty of other things as well. And that's just, it's important for us. It's a reminder of where we once were in bondage and what Israel would call Egypt, but we were in slavery to sin, and we have now been set free to serve a new master and a much more compassionate, loving, merciful master. Right. So it is a constant reminder that we have been passed over. We've had mercy shown towards us. So.
For sure. And the part when I mentioned Jesus being the Passover lamb, I find that in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. If you want to, if you do want to go and read that, that's where I get that idea from. That Jesus is now our Passover lamb, essentially. And when I say like it's a meal, right? It's different. The way that we partake of it's not a meal. Again, if you want to read 1 Corinthians, but. It's not the way that they would have done it back then. We're like there for 7 days. They ate this actual like feast, right? We're not here to feast. This isn't something that we're doing, right? We do the specific things that Jesus told his disciples to do when he established it. I just want to clear that up. I'm not talking about we don't like sit around and eat like a big meal together or anything like that. But yeah, any other thoughts on the kind of the why, I guess, the history of the Lord's Supper?
Nothing else on the history.
Yeah. So when we come back, the question we're going to answer next is why we take it the way that we do and why we take it as often as we do.
Charlie has done so far an excellent job walking us through the beginnings and origins of the Passover and how that leads us into the Lord's Supper. And now we're going to talk a little bit about why we take it as often as we do and the importance of that. So
yeah,
go
for sure. Yeah, so my entire life that I can remember, the Lord's Supper has been something that's like, it's a hard, like this does not get, like you do not compromise this. Like you're going to be there to partake of the Lord's Supper like every Sunday. It's extremely important. That was drilled into me from a very young age as to how important this actually was. Though I didn't fully understand exactly what it meant, I knew that it was important and it was something that you did. Like you did not miss the opportunity to partake of the Lord's Supper. Like you tried to be there. Like if at all possible, you needed to go to do this because this was a command that was given to us. I was trained that it's the most important part of our worship service. Like that's the most important reason why, we come together is to partake of this. And it was to be taken every week. And that's just what I was told, And so that's the way that I was raised to believe. And so that obviously stuck with me because that's still in my memory today. But is this actually true? Is this something that we're supposed to be taking every week? Is it actually, that important? Can I just remember the sacrifice of Jesus without actually taking the Lord's Supper? Can I get away with just once a month, once a year, every other week? Am I in the wrong for skipping a week every now and then? I think these questions, hit a lot of us in different ways, whether we've asked them or we've heard different people ask them, or we know of people that believe these things. I know it's a lot of questions, but it's each one of those questions is something that I've either asked myself or I've heard somebody ask or I've seen somebody that believes that. The main one that I've probably heard is that it's like you don't actually have to take it every week. every other week, once a month, every year, something like that. And I think this is something that hit a lot of us, especially last year too, when we were home in quarantine. This raised a lot of questions, I feel like, for a lot of people around the Lord's Supper specifically. Was I actually supposed to be partaking of it when I was home? If I was by myself, was I supposed to be partaking of it? Are we really taking of it together over like Zoom? Should we have come together just to partake of the Lord's Supper? And I don't have an answer really for that. It was a very confusing time, and I'm just glad that we're past it. Hopefully we don't go back there again. But I think that there were a lot of questions that were raised about that. And so, I don't know, Alexander, do you believe that the Lord's Supper is a hard command from Jesus? Do you believe that it's just like a suggestion, and why? Why do you believe that?
So I believe it is a hard command from Jesus. If you go back to the passages that we read through, like this is, I know a lot of places where it's etched into their little Lord's Supper table, do this in remembrance of me. So it is this call every time we go to the table to remind ourselves of Jesus' sacrifice. What is the importance of him going to the cross? What is the importance of him dying? How much did our sin cost? All that type of stuff. What is the worth of our soul? It has so much importance and relevance to when we actually remember this. So I think that first of all is a hard command from Jesus. We have kind of a pattern in Acts where we see how when the supper was taken, and also just from traditional history, we know that this is when they met on Sundays to take this feast and this supper. We're also reminded, particularly the back half of 1 Corinthians 11, about taking the Lord's Supper isn't about like having this meal or any of this other type of stuff. It's this reminder of coming to the Lord and reminding ourselves of that. So some of the, like, particularly with people who maybe lean towards Catholicism, they have Christ's Mass, Christmas, and that is like the one time a year. If they take it either that Christmas or they take it on Easter, or just 2 times a year. The danger with that is that humanity are really dumb. Like we forget stuff, and that's why I think that the Sabbath happens so often, is so that they could be reminded that you're supposed to trust in the Lord every single week. That's why they had Passover every year, but not just Passover. They had 7 feasts throughout the year, and all of them were a call to remind them about something different, a call to remind them about their bondage, a call to remind them of their wandering in the wilderness, the Day of Atonement, the reminder that they were broken and that they needed God's forgiveness. So I really think it's an important command because it reminds us, not just on that day, Lord willing, not just on that day, but as we go through the rest of the week, I have been sacrificed for, the sin has been paid for. I need to be telling people about this, and I need to be living according to it. So,
can I remember the Lord's death without the Lord's Supper? Absolutely you can. And that's something that you should be doing for sure. But like you said, when the passage that you reference, I think in Acts specifically, in Acts 20 verse 7, is when it talks about, they gathered on the first of the week to break bread, and when they talk about breaking bread, that's what we think. They're talking about partaking the Lord's Supper. The same with Acts chapter 2 and verse 42. It mentions breaking bread together like 2 different times there. And I think one of them is when they're just in their home having fellowship with one another, but I think the other one, at the first one in verse 42, is specifically talking about them partaking of the Lord's Supper. We see them right as soon as the apostles kind of start the church actually going after Jesus' sins. It's like one of the first things that they do is they're breaking bread. They're partaking of this Lord's Supper, the thing that Jesus had just instituted for them just a few weeks before. Not even that, just like a week before. And so, they see them immediately start partaking of this and establishing it within the church that they're going to do this. It's interesting because you wonder, the disciples probably had no idea what it meant when he first was establishing it. Like, what is he doing? Like, okay, and breaking this bread, and like, oh, it's body, that's weird, or blood, that's weird. Okay, whatever. And then Jesus dies and is raised again. They're like, oh.
And I mean,
I get it.
As these Jewish people, they had been taking it in a certain way for their entire lives. This was a revolutionary take on, but I think, you start hearing those echoes, you start seeing the patterns of what Jesus did how that replaces a lamb, all that
Yeah.
good stuff. So I would really encourage you that if you aren't going to a congregation that is taking Lord's Supper every week, I'd really encourage you to go to one that does, because this is a really important aspect of our worship. And why do we take it together? I think it emphasizes the need for community and the reminder of this is a community of people who have been sacrificed for. So that when I'm taking this cup, I know that not only was a sacrifice for me, it was a sacrifice for everybody else in this room.
Yep.
And then we can come together and remember the Lord in this way. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and to kind of really also show, and you mentioned this, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is probably one of the best passages where we can look at the sheer importance of it and what it can mean if we don't take it properly. And so I'm actually going to read in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 17 to the end of the chapter. Paul says, "But in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And I believe in part, for there must be factions among you in order, that those who are genuine among you may be recognized, that when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. If one goes hungry, another gets drunk. What, do you not have houses to drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way he also took the cup after the supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and the blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judged ourselves truly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined, so that we may not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for judgment. About the other things, I will give directions when I come." So he breaks down a lot of different things in this passage. And so you can kind of infer from it that there was obviously an issue, several issues happening in the church in Corinth, but one of them specifically was around the Lord's Supper. When they were coming together and they were partaking of it, they obviously were not partaking of it in the right way. It had become more like a common meal for them where they were eating and drinking together. They weren't really waiting on everybody. They didn't really see the importance of it. They weren't exactly believing, or they weren't exactly discerning what they were supposed to mean, like what the actual meaning of it was. They were more or less just, it seems like they were just kind of eating like a common meal together.
And like when you consider Corinth as a city, you have it's a port town, so you have some people there that would be rich, super wealthy, but that also means that a lot of the first century Christians were slaves. So you have really rich people and you have slaves, and we see that there's kind of this discrimination, this division between the two of them, where they don't care about the slaves. And that's kind of what we learn through history, that most of the services happen like at night so that the slaves would be able to come to service, but they weren't waiting on them and all that type of stuff. So Paul takes this very seriously, and it reminds us of how seriously we should be taking it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that really comes alive in verse 27 when he says, "Whoever eats of the bread or drinks of the cup in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and the blood of the Lord." So not only are you messing it up, but now you're guilty of, killing Jesus, basically, is what he's saying there. And so it really shows the importance of why you need to partake of it in the way that you're supposed to, which is, discerning the body of Jesus, right? The bread, which represents Jesus' body, the blood, or the cup, which represents Jesus' blood, which was shed for us. the sacrifice that was given for us, what it actually means for us. And specifically, I like that he talks about the covenant that Jesus talks about that he made in his blood, right? This promise that Jesus has made with us, this pact that he has made with us. Same as what God had made with the people of Israel, where he's their God and they're his people. Now Jesus is ours, and he has freed all of us, like we talked about, from the bondage of sin, and has made this covenant with us to be his children. And it was through that sacrifice that we're able to do that. And that's something that we can talk a lot about and for a long time about, because it is just so important. Because that's why we're here, right? That if it's not for the death of Jesus and for his resurrection, then there's no point of any of this even happening, right? The Bible is meaningless at that point if we don't have that, just like Paul also talks about. But right, that's why this is just such an important thing for us to do. First of all, when they gather together to do this. So that's why we take it as often as we do. And then the reason why we take it the way that we take it is because it's the way that Jesus established it, right? We really do try to follow exactly the same way that Jesus did when he instituted it. And then what we see Paul talk about here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, right? We try to follow along those lines. And really, what's more important than the physical side of actually taking it is the mental side of what you're actually thinking about and how you're discerning those things as you're partaking of it, which is just as important as partaking in it of itself. Because if you're not taking it correctly, then you're going to be guilty of the body and blood of Jesus. And that's something that I don't want to be guilty of when I stand before God someday. And I don't think any of us would probably want to be guilty of. So how do you answer that question? Why did you kill my son? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. Like, there's nothing you can say. No. But yeah. So that's kind of, why we take it the way that we do and as often as we do. And I think when we come back in the next session that we're going to talk about is how do we keep this, though, so it's something that we do to becoming just this kind of meaningless ritual. And in that, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into actually what you should be thinking about as we partake of it. Did you have any other comments on the why we take it or as often as we do?
Well, it's just a reminder, and I appreciate the weekly reminder because, when I say that humans are idiots, it's because I'm an idiot, and that's the way that I mess up all throughout this week, and it helps me to remind myself about, if Christ is sacrificed for me, am I only living for him for 3 hours on Sunday, or am I living for him each and every day of the week, which is what I should be doing? So it's this reminder, and it centers me every single week, the beginning of it. What am I called to do for the rest of the week? Yeah. So I've come to appreciate it a lot, and I think that should help us as well.
And if you're someone who thinks of, maybe it's not a weekly thing, I would love for you guys to reach out and let us know, and maybe give us your side of it and kind of share with us your thoughts on it. Just because, I'm always willing to learn, what different people think about this or how you may interpret these passages differently. But what we're trying to do is just to take God's word for what it is and do what Jesus did and do what Paul did to try to, get to heaven so that we won't be guilty of it. But yeah. So when we come back, we're going to talk a bit about how we, like I said, how we keep this from becoming just this kind of meaningless ritual that we do every week. So thank y'all very much. Welcome back. As we move into our last section, what we want to talk about is, has the Lord's Supper become a meaningless ritual? And if not, how do we keep it from becoming that? Because I think if we're not careful, it can very easily become that way for us. Because we saw it kind of become more like that for the people in Corinth. So obviously, if it could happen to them, it could happen to us, where we're not really partaking of it in the way that we're supposed to. We forget the entire idea of it altogether. When before, in the time before we started filming this and kind of the off camera, Alexander and I were talking about one of my favorite stories around the Lord's Supper is when the disciples were trying to figure out who's going to betray Jesus, and they just straight up asked Jesus, like, Lord, who's going to betray you? And it's like, it's he to whom I give this morsel of bread. And he dips it, he gives it to Judas, and like while he's doing that, I don't know how you're more obvious. Like, okay, the person's going to betray me is the one I'm giving this to. Wink, it's Judas. And the apostles' response to that is, but is it me? But is it me though? Is it me? And then Judas leaves, and they're like, oh, he's going to help out the needy. And it's like, they completely miss the point. Like, they're so caught up in, being guilty of killing Jesus, they don't want it to be them, that they completely miss the entire idea of that it's Judas. They just go over their heads altogether. And so is that us? Do we just completely miss the point, right? Are we focusing on the wrong things that are causing us to completely miss the entire idea of it altogether, to where we end up being guilty of it, like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 11? Or are we actually doing what we're supposed to? And so, oftentimes I think it's hard to believe for us as Christians to think why people believe Christianity is a cult. But, to me, it's obvious that we're so different from a cult as Christians, right? We don't do things like cults do. But when I try to think it from their perspective, right, and I imagine myself like, okay, if I was an atheist, and I walked into a church and I saw these people passing around trays full of grape juice and bread, and I was told that the bread represents the body of some guy who was killed and the juice is somebody's blood, and you're drinking that. If I was someone who didn't understand anything about it, it'd be a little weird. Like, it'd be a little understandably weird. And so, if I had no understanding or knowledge of the Bible and I saw a group of people doing this, I would probably be a little weirded out. But the question is that what the Lord's Supper has actually become? Is it just some like meaningless, like cultish ritual for us? And if not, how do we keep it from becoming that? Do you think overall, has the Lord's Supper become this kind of meaningless ritual that churches do every week?
For me, I think you have to judge that on an individual basis. Do you take it seriously personally? Because if it can become ritualistic for you specifically, where you're just not listening, all that type of stuff, you're not being consistent with it. I think that overall, the fact that churches keep doing it means that it does mean something, and that people are keeping it sincere. And I think a lot of people don't do it just based off of tradition. I think a lot of people are very sincere about it. So overall, when it comes to churches doing it, I think that it's still meaningful. But I think that it can very, very easily become just you show up to service. It's like, okay, here I go. This is what I got to do. Yeah, this is what I've always done, that type of thing. So
yeah, if I'm just being like purely honest, right there, looking back on it, there have been Sundays in my life when we have like that part of church, right, or part of worship service where we do the Lord's Supper, and I blink and it's over, and I look back on it and I'm like, wait, did I just partake of the Lord's Supper? Like, I was not paying attention like at all. Like, I just completely missed over it altogether, whether I was thinking about some other thing, like my mind got sidetracked, or I was just completely zoning out altogether, right? I just completely just skipped over that. And I take that as I blame myself for that, right? There's no one else to blame but me. It's not something that the church did that made me do that. But it was just, me not being disciplined enough to actually meditate upon what I'm supposed to be thinking about during that time, and taking that time to really focus on Jesus. So I'm glad you brought that up, that it's a personal thing, not necessarily the group as a whole thing. So, what can we practically do to keep this from becoming just a meaningless ritual? So Alexander, let's say it's Sunday morning, and it's the time that we're going to partake of the Lord's Supper. What do you do? What is your Lord's Supper routine?
Right. So, congregation that we attend, and every congregation I've been at, before the Lord's Supper, we have like a little talk to kind of bring our minds in. I think that's a really good practice. It'll help us so we aren't just jumping in and out of it. So, when someone is up there, I'm making sure I'm paying pretty close attention, especially like I hope that you're using scripture every time you get up there to speak. So when they use scripture, I'm going to make sure I'm going to be turning there. When the bread gets passed around, which we usually do bread first and then grape juice. So when the bread gets passed around, I'd usually take that time to take the bread and then I kind of pray, and it's kind of my meditation on this past week, and oftentimes asking for forgiveness for the places that I failed to remember the Lord's sacrifice that week. So that's usually where I start, is that just praying. And then when we do the grape juice, that's when I read. So either this is a passage that I've kind of predetermined that I'm going to be reading, or since I preach, I'll also be thinking about my upcoming sermon, so I'll be reading a passage based upon that. So whatever it is, it's just kind of this focus that, either on my prayer and thinking about this past week, and sometimes I pray through both if I don't have enough time or something like that. So it changes a bit, but overall it's just I really try to meditate, and that's what's helped me a lot in my growth. So
yeah, I'm getting like a Romans vibe from that for some reason, where it's like I'm a failure, I'm bad, but I have Jesus in the Lord's Supper, and then you can be a Christian. I don't know. I get total Romans vibes from that.
That is my
vibe. But no, I think that's really, really good. When I was a kid, this wasn't exactly something that I think was just like spelled out for me. That was exactly covered, where somebody said, "This is what I think about during the Lord's Supper. This is exactly what I do during the Lord's Supper." And I remember when I was first baptized, like I was trying to figure out like, what exactly am I supposed to be doing? Like anytime I would ask, it was always the same answer. Well, you remember the Lord's death. What does that mean? How do I just sit there and like think in my mind like, Jesus died, Jesus died, Jesus died, Jesus died. How am I do I just mentally picture the crucifixion in my mind? Do I read? Do I pray? Like what exactly do I do to kind of keep my mind focused? But looking back on that and my getting upset with no one actually spelling it out for me, I kind of see my immaturity in that, because I think there's actually a reason why no one really spelled out exactly for me what I'm supposed to do. And that is because it's going to be different for everybody. Like you gave us your routine and I'll give what I do, but mine's a little different than yours, but that doesn't make any one of them wrong. There's not like a specific thing that God says, this is exactly what you're supposed to do when you're partaking of it. I think each and every one of us is going to remember it in different ways. It's not something that can be scripted, because I think that if it was a scripted thing for everybody, then there would be an even greater chance of it becoming just this kind of mindless ritual, because you don't have to think as much anymore. You just go into that scripted mode where you're doing the same exact thing every single week and everyone's doing that same thing together, and then it loses its meaning altogether. And we kind of see that throughout the Pharisees. I feel like that was one of their biggest issues that they had, right? Where they did try to like script out every little thing, right? Where they tried to give a command for every single thing that God said. And Jesus is like, you've missed the point. Like you've missed the idea altogether by trying to be so careful and build these hedges around yourselves. You've missed the idea completely. Yeah. And so I feel like if that's the way that we treated the Lord's Supper, where we had the very specific things that we were supposed to do, then we would be just like the Pharisees, and we would miss the idea altogether. And so I see my fault in that, when I would question why no one ever really told me what to do. I understand why they didn't. Not that they thought about that when they weren't, but like I'm trying to think the best in people. And understand that, right, we can't all do the same thing, because then it would lose meaning.
If you do have a question about what to think about, just feel free to ask somebody.
Yeah, for sure.
Don't just hold in it. So
yeah, no, yeah, for sure. Reach out. And I, like I said, I'll give what I do. But just because it's not what you specifically do doesn't mean that what you're doing is wrong and what I'm doing is right. It just means that this is how I remember. And so, yeah. And maybe that's, how you are, like Alexander said. Maybe you sit there and you just wonder, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to think about? And you get kind of caught up in the what ifs, and you kind of lose sight of what the whole overall idea is. And then suddenly the Lord's Supper's over and you've missed it altogether. And yeah, definitely reach out for sure. So what I do is it's kind of changed now. It had to change like pre-COVID and now like post-COVID. What I did before is different than what I did now, because before I felt like we had more time, more time to Lord's Supper. Yeah. So I guess the one advantage of passing, so we don't pass trays around anymore like we used to. We literally had the bread in a tray, and then we had like the grape juice in other trays, and we pass those around. And that would take like a pretty good bit of time to do, because it had to go row by row, handing out the trays, they pass down up and down. And because of COVID and things like that, not wanting to have a lot of contact with a lot of other people, which is probably smart, we've gone to like the individual like servings of it now. So everybody already has it with them. And so it like significantly shortened the amount of time that it took. So pre-COVID, when they passed it around, for me and myself, my attention span is not fantastic. So for me to try to sit there, especially in my younger years, the entire time and then just try to meditate, my mind is going to be tempted to wander at some point during that, and it likely will. And so what I did then was kind of like you did. I would do like a mixture of, I would read a passage, whether that was just an account of Jesus' death, just because I wanted to be thinking about that, or it was a passage like in Romans, just something, whether it was the institution of the Passover, something that would keep my mind focused on the sacrifice of Jesus and what it meant for me. Then when I would get either the bread or the juice, I would, partake of it. I would pray and I would meditate after that for a little bit, and I would really think about it. And then I would go back to reading again if I needed to. If my mind started more, I would read again, and then I would do the same thing for the next one. But now I don't really have that much time anymore. Now we have the talk, and then we like instantaneously partake of the bread, and then we partake of the juice. And so what I do now is I pretty much just pray the entire time and then do some meditation. It's very similar to yours, where oftentimes I find myself now, when I am thinking about and praying about Jesus' sacrifice for me, I can't help but think about how I am such a failure of a person. When I think about what he did for me and the lengths that he was willing to go to save me, I can't help but think about all those times that I have rejected that sacrifice. And like you said, forgotten about that sacrifice and gone back into sin where I was before I ever had Jesus. Yeah. And it's heartbreaking for me to think about it in that way, because you're thinking about the sacrifice that Jesus did, and I'm just such a failure.
I think in some ways that can be healthy. And I would discourage it from like happening too often. But like, for me, I've like a lot of my sermons have been really focused on this hope that we really find. But I also try to strike this balance of hope because you were hopeless and you were broken, you're messed up, and that, so you shouldn't always come out of church feeling like, oh yeah, everything is perfect. It should at times like really hurt you, because you're reminded of what you've done. And I think the Lord's Supper is a perfect place for that. So you're reminded of this is what it cost. But it doesn't just mean that for the rest of the week you're a complete Debbie Downer and you hate everything. You treat everything. It's supposed to be like, this, I was broken and Christ has healed me. He's made me his own, that type of thing. That's what makes me walk the way I do. So I think there's a healthy balance between understanding your flaws and your brokenness, but also you've been forgiven and you walk accordingly.
Yeah. Another side question that I had kind of, about the Lord's Supper is, a lot of times we focus very heavily on the death of Jesus, not so much on the resurrection side of it. Do you think that there is a danger in only focusing really on the death and forgetting about the resurrection? Do you think we should just focus on the death, or do you think we should focus on the whole thing altogether? Because in my mind, you can't have one without the other. Because if Jesus just died, like Paul said, that's it, then this is all meaningless. So
I think
he had to raise. But
I think you're 100% right. Like while the memorial Jesus says specific for his body and his blood, if you forget, like it, everyone dies. So Jesus' death, while it was significant for a lot of the like supernatural things that happen around it, and being the only innocent person to really die, if you take out the resurrection, then the meal, as you've mentioned already, and Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, the meal means nothing. Our faith means nothing. Your hope means nothing. Your faith means nothing. Like all of that just disappears. So I think that the importance on the death is important, like when you're talking through it. But if you don't emphasize the resurrection as well, you're missing a pretty significant portion of the picture.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's exactly right. So yeah, that's what we think about. That's kind of what we do as we're partaking. And again, just because it's not what you do does not mean that what you're doing is wrong. We're all going to remember that in different ways. And whether that's just sheer meditation or reading or praying, I think that any combination of any of those, I think would be a good thing. The other question that I have for you too is, do you think we put, in the church as a whole, do you think we put too little focus on the Lord's Supper? Do you think that we should focus more of it? Because to me, it's like, right, the Lord's Supper is that like 10-minute little segment that we have as a part of worship service where it's kind of there and it happens. But I visited when I was in San Francisco and we worshiped with Josh and Kirby Lewis and Josh and Katie Carter when they were there working. One of the things that they did, a part of their service, was it was like 50-50 split where they had like a shorter sermon than normal, but they had a really, really long time where they partook of the Lord's Supper. And they had like almost like a mini sermon and a lesson on it where they really focused heavily on that as a part of their worship. And I really liked that. I don't know. Do you think that it's become just this little too short, I guess, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a really cool idea that they do out in San Francisco. And you already shared your story where you like blinked one time and it was over. And I think that kind of has what the Lord's Supper has become. Get your 5-minute talk out of the way. Get the cup, and especially as you're saying with...
You got to have the song, man. The song first.
Oh, the song first, right?
Then the 5-minute
Night
talk.
with Evan Pinion, and then...
then the 5-minute talk.
And then, like you said, with COVID, you say the amen after the prayer, after you pray over the thing, and you get the little crinkles after. And then you get like a minute and a half. And even when I did it, like I was trying to wait like an extended time.
It's awkward,
and it was still
the entire time I'm sitting there, I'm like feeling the weight of people like, are you going back up there anytime soon, sir? I'm trying to get to lunch.
I'm trying to get to like Golden Corral.
I can feel that on my shoulders. I'm like, I need to go back up there. Yeah. It's like, I want to take longer, but I can't.
For sure. Yeah. So, and I think that's a part of the problem is the fact that we think that, okay, snip, snap, we want to get this thing over with. We know it's important. We know we should do it. One of the things that I think Northwood did back here, and we did it at Embry Hills as well, but like when we had a fifth Sunday, we took that entire
Lord's Supper service
worship hour, to do a Lord's Supper service. So I think that that is an excellent thing where we take it and it's like at least, I don't remember how many fifth Sundays there are in a year, but we take this extended period out and we think about the importance of the sacrifice, and we're reminded that it's not just as you've talked about, a mindless ritual. This is an impactful thing that has changed our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, and how we walk for the rest of time. So I think we have to take it very seriously, and I think that there's plenty of ways that we can mix it up, maybe make it a variety so that we put emphasis where it belongs.
Yeah. Do you feel like if you had to rank the reasons why we gather together every week, obviously, right? We gather together. We want to study from God's word. We want to better ourselves to become more like Jesus. We want to have fellowship with one another. Then we want to partake of the Lord's Supper, right? Which of those would you say is the most important? Or can you say that any one of those is the most important?
I'd be hesitant to say.
Tough question.
Yeah, I'd be hesitant to say anyone is more important than the other. Yeah. But of course, when it comes to why in the world are we even a family? Why are we community? It's going to be the Lord's Supper. So I'm going to put that one at 1. I think number 2, if we were going to rank this,
you don't have to.
We're still breaking. Well, I'm going to now. You can. I think public reading of Scripture is the second most important thing, and that's kind of something that gets overlooked a lot. And then singing, I think, is 3, and then the sermon is like the last. So even for me as a preacher, I understand that my part in this is so most important. Small. I'm the least important aspect of this. The rest of it, the really driving force for why we're there is remembering what the Lord has done in all of us. Yeah. So, and we need to read Scripture more out loud together. So.
No, I agree. I think that is like I was taught growing up, right? It is extremely important. I think that's something that we should continue. Like it is so important. Because I agree with you. I think it is a command from Jesus. Like he tells us to do this to remember him. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I agree 100%.
Some additional things, just in case, you're struggling with keeping your mind, or I don't know, getting a little mindless. I would encourage you that as you go through your week and you're struggling with a temptation or something, that you remember back to your supper. Mm-hmm. Because, again, for us right now, it's something we should be working on. But for 10 minutes on a Sunday, we're thinking about Jesus. Every time you're going through temptation or you're struggling with something, consider what Jesus has gone through you. So, for instance, using our podcast from last week, we're talking about forgiveness. And you have to go and you have to forgive someone who's done something really, really awful to you. And you're like, I just really don't want to do this. They don't deserve forgiveness, all this type of stuff. Yeah. If you remember back to the supper, you can be reminded, I didn't deserve forgiveness either. Yep. And Jesus showed it to me. So as you go through your week, it's this constant reflection. It's not just a one-day thing. It's like, so what Jesus did for me influences how my life goes from this point on. And I think that will have a tremendous impact on when you come on Sunday, a reminder of, did I think about what I'm taking about? Because I think, you worry about taking an unworthy manner on Sunday. Are you living in a manner unworthy of it for the rest of the week?
Yeah, that's good.
So just, I think taking that into consideration will be really helpful for you as well.
For sure.
And maybe like if your congregation isn't doing something specifically, maybe you could just ask the elders and be like, hey, I would like some more emphasis put on Lord's Supper or something like that. We could have an opportunity to think about it more, or
for
whatever
sure.
else. And if you have the opportunity to lead the Lord's Supper talk, I would encourage you not to use the most well-known passages about it. Like that is one of my pet peeves, because the whole message of the Bible points towards Jesus and his death and his resurrection. So we should be using a lot more than just a couple of NT passages that we have. And so I think the way I use it is just, be a little bit more creative. And I think that when you have that responsibility to lead people in thoughts about Jesus and his death, you have to take that very seriously, just as seriously as a sermon or an invitation or whatever else. So
for sure.
just some encouragements there about making this more important, less ritualistic. I think those things would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Anything else overall on the Lord's Supper as a whole?
This is a good one.
Yeah. Hope this helps you guys for sure. And again, if you have any other ideas on that, or maybe you interpret something differently or you do something differently, reach out. Let us know. I'd love to hear what your thoughts on that are for sure.
Yeah.
So
thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Pilgrim Song. We are so thankful for you guys listening, and we are thankful to Jesus for his sacrifice, bringing us together, and hopefully this encouraged you and strengthened you. Yesterday was Sunday, so this week, hopefully you'll think about the Lord's Supper, but next week, let us know if you were able to think about some things, meditate on some things, help change your mindset up a little bit. So we'd be encouraged to hear that, and we hope this encouraged you. Thank you guys again for listening. We hope you have a blessed week, and we will see you